Okay, now that I've given you an overview of the menstrual cycle, let's take a look at the menstrual cycle in greater detail. So we're going to look at what happens during each phase um, in both the ovaries and in the uterus. We're going to be using the ovarian cycle as our kind of reference timeline, but we will be looking at events in both the ovaries and the uterus as we make our way through the menstrual cycle. Okay. So we are going to start with the early follicular phase. Um, all right, so during the early follicular phase, FSH and LH levels increase. Okay, so you can kind of see that GnRH is causing FSH and LH secretion. That then is going to stimulate estrogen secretion from the follicles. So FSH is going to stimulate the granulosa cells, LH is going to stimulate the thecal cells, and basically kind of the end result of all of that is that we get an increase in estrogen production. That estrogen production causes the follicles to develop, okay? A couple things that I want to point out to you here. One is that the estrogen production provides negative feedback back onto FSH, LH, and GnRH production. Okay. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that the estrogen production provides positive feedback onto the follicles. So that's going to lead to more estrogen production. So I'd like you to take a moment now and think about what the results of those are, right? So first, like what is kind of the main result of having this negative feedback that the estrogens are placing on FSH, LH, and GnRH production? And then the second thing I want you to think about is what is the result of having the estrogens provide positive feedback back on the follicles? So go ahead, hit pause, think about that for a second, and come back when you are ready. Okay, so it might be a little confusing, but let's go over this. Okay, so we have these estrogens providing negative feedback back on FSH, LH, and GnRH production. That basically is going to prevent the recruitment of additional follicles. Okay, so we have like kind of that initial FSH and LH that's going to the follicles to stimulate some follicles to start to develop. But once those few follicles begin to develop, they are going to provide negative feedback back on FSH, LH, and GnRH production so that we don't, basically to prevent further recruitment of more follicles. Okay. Okay, second thing, the estrogen. So why do we have the estrogen providing positive feedback back on the follicles here, or what is the result of that? Basically, the result of that is that those estrogens are kind of causing those follicles to develop even further. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically it. So overall, what we're doing is we are stimulating a few follicles to start to develop. Those follicles are going to secrete estrogen. That estrogen is going to help those already developing follicles to develop even more because it's going to stimulate the follicles to secrete more estrogen, which is then going to cause them to develop more and to secrete more estrogen and so on, positive feedback loop, okay? But that estrogen is also shutting down our GnRH, FSH, LSH, LH, so that we don't get additional follicles starting to develop, okay? Taking a closer look at the follicles themselves. So during follicle development, what happens, one of the main things that happens is that these granulosa cells that are in the wall of the follicle are going to be secreting antral fluid. So antral fluid is going to build up more and more as the follicles develop, okay? And overall, what I want to show you, and I already made reference to before, is that initially we recruit a few primary follicles. Those are going to, again, as I just explained, they're going to provide positive feedback onto themselves to basically encourage their own development, okay? Eventually, one of those follicles is going to end up outpacing the other follicles, because basically whichever one gets a head start is going to like end up secreting more estrogen and developing even more and secreting even more estrogen and so on. Okay. So one of them is going to kind of outpace the others and become the dominant follicle here. Okay. The others are going to undergo a hormonally regulated cell death. All right, so that is what happens in the ovaries. Now let's take a look at what happens in the uterus, okay, during the follicular phase. Okay, so during the follicular phase, which refers to what's happening in the ovaries, what we have happening in the uterus at the beginning is menses. Okay, so menses, like I described before, is basically a dying off of the endometrium, a shedding of the endometrium. So that's going to happen at the beginning of the follicular phase. And I'll explain why this happens later, kind of when we make it all the way around to the end of the menstrual cycle. Um, but what happens kind of during the second half of the follicular phase is that remember that we have that that estrogen being made by the follicles in the ovaries, okay? That estrogen makes it to the uterus where it stimulates proliferation. So proliferation is basically cell division, basically a building up of the wall. So um, our cells are undergoing cell division to make the wall thicker. At the same time, we are trying to provide the supplies that we need. So we're going to increase our blood and nutrient supply to that tissue. And again, that's going to be in preparation for pregnancy.